Hey guys, how's it going? This is our next lesson, and it's a lesson I'm really excited about. It will be probably a little bit longer than previous lessons, but only long in terms of the materials that I have for you. In terms of writing it, you don't have to write more than you usually do. 10 to 15 sentences will suffice and will be good. So the question for this is, were the Dark Ages really dark? Now, what do we mean by that? When we say was a period dark, it's almost saying was a period regressive? Was it a bad period? Was it a period of no progress? Was it a period of war and things just being backwards? Was it a step back? The Dark Ages refers to a time between the end of the Roman Empire, so in the 450s, to about the Renaissance, which happens in the 1400s in Europe. Now, in that period, 450 to about 1400, this is known as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Now, why the Middle Ages? Well, because it happened in the middle of those two periods. It's called the Dark Ages because historians, historically, have called it a dark period. They said that not much was going on during that time, and it was a terrible time. So, what I want to do is find out, were these Dark Ages actually dark? And the way to find that out is to look at primary and secondary sources. So I'm going to look at some primary and secondary sources and determine, were they actually dark? And so were you, and you're going to give me an answer in 10 to 15 sentences. Okay? So let's take a look at our very first document here. So document A, textbook. So this is a textbook from 1954. Now, just so you know, textbooks from 1954 were not always the best sources. Why am I reading it? Well, it gives you some perspective about how people felt at the time. But textbooks from the 1950s weren't great because that was sort of a way of thinking that's a few generations dated. So we kind of want to breeze past that. With that said, what did this textbook have to say about the Dark Ages? Let's read. During the early Middle Ages, much of Europe passed through a time of turmoil and confusion, of ignorance and lawlessness. The early Middle Ages may justly be called the Dark Age. Alright, so that paragraph says, hey, we can call the Middle Ages the Dark Age because it was a time of turmoil, confusion, ignorance, and lawlessness. Turmoil meaning just bad things going on. Confusion meaning people had no guidance. Ignorance, people literally did not know what they should know. And lawlessness, people did not follow the laws. Keep reading. During the early Middle Ages, from 476 to about 1100, European civilization slipped back into semi-barbarism. So what they're saying is during that time, humanity takes a step back, and we go from civilizations to being more barbaric, more like animals and less like humans. The chief cause of this decline was lack of a government which could keep order. The Germanic kingdoms, which had been set up by 476, were unable to suppress violence. So what they're saying there is the governments that were there, they were weak. They couldn't stop people from being violent with each other. There were so many highway robbers that travel became dangerous. Europe suffered a decline in commerce and manufacturing, in education, in literature and the arts, and in almost all that makes possible a high civilization. Cities grew smaller and in some cases practically disappeared. And Western Europe became a region of poverty-stricken farming communities, each virtually isolated from the rest of the world. So what they're saying here is humanity stepped back. Everything takes a step back. Trade, travel, manufacturing, education, literature, the arts, anything that makes a civilization, it all took a step back. It wasn't as good as it was in the Roman times. Okay, I mean, look, the Roman Empire was sort of the pinnacle of human civilization to some people, so the Dark Ages look like less just because they weren't as organized. But, you know, does that mean that it was a dark period? I don't know. This document seems to think it is. This textbook from the 1950s. So they would say that it is. Let's go to the next textbook. If you look down here at document B, this textbook is from 2002, so a little closer to our time. What do they have to say about the Dark Ages? From 1000 to 1300, the economy of Europe developed and prospered. Okay, so that means it took a step forward. Prosperity literally means that more people have good lives, that more people have money. Available farmland tripled, and the food supply increased notably, bringing up the population. Europeans resettled lands that had been depopulated by the 9th and 10th century invasions, and also opened new lands for farming. Technological improvements like the heavy plow, the shoulder collar for horses, metal horseshoes, and more efficient water and windmills contributed to the jump in food supply. Between 500 and 1300, Europe's population grew from 25 million to more than 70 million. Okay, well, this is really interesting because this says there was more food, there was a rise in the population. If there's more food, a rise in the population, and the economy develops and prospers, how can you really call that a dark period? That sounds like a pretty good period. I mean, are people going to have children when things are dark? Maybe some, but not more. But the population goes up during that time, which tells you that there was more food to feed more people. You're not going to have food if you can't feed your family. So this second textbook doesn't seem to think that the period was so dark. Now, they are talking about the latter part of the Dark Ages, towards the end, 1000 to 1300. But really, it doesn't sound like this document thinks the Dark Ages were that dark because the population went up, there was food, and the economy was doing pretty well. So these two textbooks disagree. I want to get some primary sources, some things from the actual time period, and find out, were the Dark Ages actually dark? So that's A and B there. Document C, the Abbey of Xanten Records. Let me read this and then I'll explain. The following document is from the yearly records of the Abbey of Xanten, a city in modern-day Germany. An abbey is a place where Catholic monks and nuns live. The document describes Europe's troubles in the mid-9th century. It focuses on invasions by heathens or non-Christian barbarian tribes. Specifically, it mentions the Vikings or Northmen and Saracens, Arab tribes. Most of the names mentioned are cities or areas in Germany. Gaul is basically modern-day France, and Christendom is the Christian part of Europe. Okay, so this is a record that monks and nuns kept about what was going on in Europe at that time. And notice that they talk about invasions. So there were invasions during the Dark Ages, but there were invasions in other parts of history too. It's not exclusive to the Dark Ages. Let's see what they wrote down. And if we go to the bottom, it says the date is the middle of the 9th century. So that's the 800s. Okay. 845. Twice in Worms, it's pronounced Worms because it's German. They pronounce their W's as V's. Twice in Worms, there was an earthquake. In the same year, the heathen broke out upon the Christians at many points, but more than 12,000 of them died. Another party of invaders devastated Gaul, and more than 600 of them died. All right, so what they're saying is, there was an earthquake. All right, that's terrible. Was that man-caused? No, of course not. So if you want to call it the Dark Ages because there's an earthquake, well, there's been earthquakes at other times too. 12,000 people died, and then the heathen broke out upon the Christians. What that means is the heathens invaded towards where Christians lived. Godless people, barbarians were coming, and they were conquering, they were invading. So there were many invasions, there were earthquakes. 846. According to their custom, the Northmen plundered eastern and western Frisia and burned down the town of Dordrecht, with 2 other villages before the eyes of Lothair, the emperor. He was in the castle of Nimwegen, but could not punish the crime. The Northmen returned to their own country with many men and goods. At this same time, the Saracens killed all the Christians whom they found outside the walls of Rome. They also carried men and women away prisoners. Their crimes from day to day bring sorrow to Christians. So basically, what that says is these barbarians showed up, they killed people, they invaded, they took stuff, and then they went back to where they came from. Doesn't sound like a great time. Now again, this is in Xanten, and this is this one specific area. So to say this is true of all of Europe, we can't do that, but this is an example. 849. The heathen from the north caused trouble in Christendom, as usual, and grew greater in strength. But it is revolting to say more of this matter. A great famine, 853, a great famine in Saxony, so many were forced to live on horse meat. So basically, if you go point by point here, this records very bad times in Xanten, Frisia, Nimwegen, Dordrecht. These are German places, Worms. It reflects bad times from about 845 to 853. I don't know that this is enough. I'm not disputing that this is bad, but I don't know that this is enough to say that the Dark Ages were dark, because this only describes a few places and just the really bad stuff for about 8 years. I mean, it's like if you watch the news all the time, you're going to think that everything's terrible, because people only watch the news for things that are bad. People don't watch the news to, turn it on and have people go, oh yeah, nothing controversial or newsworthy happened today, nothing bad happened today. People watch it to see terrible things. So these nuns and monks are writing down things that are bad. Does it mean that there's no validity to it? No, of course it's valid. But I don't know if I could say the Dark Ages are really dark because of this. You might. It might be enough evidence for you. But there were earthquakes, there were invasions, there were famines outside of the Dark Ages. So I don't know that you can just say that it's exclusive to this time period. Okay. Go to document D, Medieval Economic Laws. Now remember that the original textbook said it was a time of lawlessness. So these are laws that were happening during the Dark Ages. Lawlessness means that there either were no laws or people didn't obey them. So let's read what these medieval laws were. These are from the late 8th and early 9th centuries, defining the worth of currency, regulating the exchange of that currency, and establishing penalties for people breaking these laws. The first two come from what is today part of France, and the third what is now part of Germany. So before we go on, this is what's used as money, regulating how much that money's worth, and then punishments for breaking the law. Doesn't sound so dark to me. But let's keep reading. Go to C11, that's clause 11. Be it noted how much the solidi, that's the unit of currency, that's their money, of the Saxons ought to be worth. It should be worth a young ox. 1 solidus should also be about 40 bushels of oats and 15 bushels of rye. For those who live near to us, 1 solidi should be worth half sigla of honey. For those who live in the north, 1 solidi should be worth 2 sigla of honey. Guys, all you need to understand there is they're saying, all right, this amount of money, this is how much it should be worth. This amount of honey or this amount of an ox. You don't need to memorize that or understand that. All you need to know is they're determining how much their money is worth. Does that sound dark to you? Does that sound bad to you? It doesn't sound bad to me. It sounds modern. We do that with our money now. So this doesn't sound dark to me. Let's keep reading. Go to where it says clause 19. Concerning false money, we have ordered that he who has been proved to have made it, meaning false money, shall have his hand cut off. And he who does not obey this, if he is free, shall pay 60 solidi. If he be serf, that means slave, let him have 60 lashes. All right, so if you make false money, there's a punishment. You get your hand cut off. Now, it's a little bit backwards. If you steal today, they put you in jail. They don't cut your hands off because it's cruel. So you can say, hey, it's a dark period because they'll cut your hands off. But by the same token, they have a very clear punishment for breaking the law. So can you really say it's dark if they have a clear punishment? No. But you can say it's dark because the punishment is cutting somebody's hand off. So you decide. Now, they have slaves during this time. Not everybody has slaves. Really wealthy people had slaves. And they say, all right, if a slave does it, whip him. Hit him with 60 lashes. All right, so they're a little bit backwards, but there were slaves in the Roman Empire. There was slavery after the Dark Ages, so can't really count slavery as being part of the Dark Ages because it's not exclusive to that. All right, go to clause 5. In all places, in all states, and in all markets, the new denarii, that's their money, shall be exchanged as money and received by all. If anyone refuses to negotiate a purchase or a sale, they can bring the case before the king. They can do this only if they are a free man. But if they are servile and they own a business, let them lose the business. Or to be stripped or to be stripped and publicly beaten in the presence of people. However, if he refuses to use the money for purchase or sale because he was ordered by his master, the master shall pay 50 solidi. All right, so what this means is the money that we're all using, this denarii in Frankfurt in Germany, everybody has to accept it. You can't say, I don't take this money. You have to accept that money. It would be like if you went to the store and you gave them cash and they went, no, we don't take this here. You have to pay us in something else. No, they have to take dollars. They have to take money. They have to take coins. That's the way it is. So they're establishing that this is how our society runs. That doesn't sound so dark to me. What does sound dark to me is they said, well, if you refuse this, you can be stripped and publicly beaten in the presence of people. That sounds like a really cruel and unusual punishment, which we would not allow here in the United States or in 2020. So that, to me, feels like part of the dark period. That feels antiquated. That feels backwards. So again, some evidence to say that it was dark and it wasn't so dark. All right? What do you think? Based on all this information, what do you think? Does it sound like a dark period or does it sound like not such a dark period? You tell me. Now you'll notice that we skipped document E. I didn't think it was relevant, so go down to document F, the rise of universities. Read this with me. Beginning in the early 11th century, universities were founded throughout Europe. Below is a list of the 10 oldest European universities in Europe. Attendance at these universities was limited to a small percentage of the population. However, universities introduced a new system of education, eventually replacing the monastery and church schools. So what we're saying here is colleges, universities, obviously you go there to gain education, to become smarter. Those people can advance our society, right? Everything from the computer or phone that you're watching this on, this all came from people who went to universities and learned more. So these universities start in the 11th century, and it starts to replace learning in the churches. Now it's learning based on science and math and things like that, whereas before, a lot of the education only happened in the churches. Now, only a small number of people could go to these universities. Just keep that in mind. It's not like everybody went, but as time progressed, more and more people could go. So take a look. 1088 in Bologna, Italy, we have the University of Bologna. 1150, the University of Paris. 1167, University of Oxford. 1209, University of Cambridge. Those are the two most famous universities, probably in all of Europe, but definitely in England. 1218, Salamanca, Spain, University of Salamanca. I like saying Salamanca. 1222, University of Padua. 1224, University of Naples, Federico II. And you get the point. So these are a ton of universities. Well, can we call this the Dark Ages if these universities are being created during this dark time? How much learning can be going on if it's a truly dark period? This sounds pretty good to me. This sounds like people are learning. This sounds like people are trying to better themselves. So I'm going to say this is an example of not being a dark period. I'm going to say this is an example of saying that the Dark Ages were not really dark. Finally, go to the bottom. This is the Notre Dame Cathedral. Document G. Read it along with me. Cathedral Notre Dame de Paris, or Our Lady of Paris Cathedral, is one of the most famous Gothic cathedrals in Europe. The Gothic style of architecture was common in the late Middle Ages. Common features of Gothic cathedrals included architectural innovations, including large columns, high ceilings with rubbed vaults, flying buttresses, and a large stained glass window. Gothic cathedrals were usually the tallest and largest buildings in a city. Notre Dame is 420 feet long, 226 feet wide, and its two towers are 226 feet high. Construction on the cathedral began in 1163 and was completed in 1345. So, a couple things. That sounds like a long time, and it was, but you also have to realize it was made 1,000 years ago. So it took almost 200 years to build during this dark period. With that said, there's a couple of new innovations to this cathedral which still stands to this day. By the way, this is the cathedral. You might have seen it in the news that burned. It's not completely burned to the ground, but a lot of it burned about a year ago. And a lot of people were upset because when people go to Paris, they like to visit this cathedral. If you look here in the first picture, it shows a flying buttress. Now what that is that's a beam that holds up the back of the cathedral. Because if you ever look at the back of a cathedral, sometimes it has the walls and then it curves almost like up into a dome in the top. That can only be held up by a flying buttress. It can't sustain itself, so the buttress pushes it and keeps it up. That was new for the time. Well, if it's new and innovative, does that really sound like the Dark Ages? Go down. If you go to the bottom left, you can see the towers in there. Okay? You can see how high it extends. And in the front, you can see a stained glass window, which is also the picture on the right. Now, there's 3 stained glass windows in the Notre Dame Cathedral. Each one is estimated to be priceless, meaning you can't even put a numeric value on it because they're so unique and so iconic. It's been estimated that each window might itself cost hundreds of billions of dollars just because it's so old and so unique. There's nothing in the world like it. Of course, there's other stained glass windows, but not this one. And if you look at all the detail in that stained glass. I mean, if you've ever been to church and seen a stained glass window, it's like a painting within a window. Does this really sound like the Dark Ages to you? I mean, you might say, hey, yeah, it took a long time to build, okay, but part of that is the period. You know, it's a lot easier to build a building now with machines and technology and electricity. But at that time, it took a long time to build building. And you look at the stained glass, I mean, it's unbelievable that they were doing that. Now, I can't do that. I can't do that in 2020. So let's take a step back. Were the Dark Ages really dark? Well, on the one hand, you had invasions from heathens, barbarians, people were pillaging and plundering, stealing, breaking the laws. On the other hand, you have the creation of this amazing cathedral that still stands to this day. You have all of these universities where people are trying to get higher education and higher learning. You have laws that people have to follow, money, you have an economy, you have clear punishments for crimes, and you have technological improvements. So what I want you to do is in 10 to 15 sentences, take some of the things from these documents and tell me what you think. Were the Dark Ages actually dark? Was this actually a bad period? I don't care if you say, yes, it was a bad period, no, it was a good period, or it was a little bit of both, but you've got to use information from these documents to help explain. So to get credit for this, use information from at least just two of these documents here, put it in your answer, and give that to me in about 10 to 15 sentences. And I look forward to reading that. If you guys have any questions, come to the Zoom call for that. Otherwise, send me an email, james.gregory@lausd.net, and I really look forward to reading your answers.